Hi all, something a little different to start this narration off. The author of today's stories, Michael Kelso, aka Horror Writer 1717, reached out to me a couple of weeks ago. Their furnace in their house stopped working, and in Pennsylvania this time of year, and heading into some colder months, it's not something the family can do without. They have asked if we can help in any way, which I'm sure we can. The first option is easy. I have 4 of Michael's stories here on this compilation. The first is a new one to the channel. The other 3 are some of my favourites I have had the pleasure to narrate. I have put ads on this compilation. Any revenue I make from it, I will double and send to Michael's family. So put the compilation on repeat for the night or during the day, and hopefully we can raise a bit of money that way. Secondly, I've included a link below where you can donate directly to Michael's family if you are in a position to do so. I know it's tough for a lot of people at the moment, so only do so if you can. Anything would be appreciated. Lastly, Michael has a good range of books available on Amazon. I'm not sure how much he makes from each one he sells, but if you'd prefer to support him that way, you'll find the link to his store below. I appreciate you all, the listeners who listen and comment on my narrations, and the amazing authors who let me narrate their stories. Hopefully we can do something here to help one out, even just a little. And now, for today's stories. I used to be a night watch at a wind farm. What I saw there still haunts me. I used to love my job. I was a watchman at a wind farm. All I had to do was make rounds a few times a night to make sure no one was messing with the wind turbines. I would read a lot of books, and eventually, if I got bored, I'd bring my portable DVD player and watch movies all night. The only thing that broke up the time was the patrols. I'd arrive every night around 9 PM and get relieved by the day shift at 9 AM. There wasn't much to it. I'd pull up beside the watchman I was relieving. We'd exchange pleasantries. He'd tell me if anything went on during the day, and then he'd be on his way. I don't remember him ever telling me anything more than seeing some deer or maybe a bear. There were a dozen windmills stretched out over 5 miles, each connected by a dirt road. When I first started working for this company, I would get out and check the locks on the access door to each windmill. After 5 years, I'd drive by and barely glance at the things. Most times, I'd be still watching my movie or show while I'm driving. Not a lot of traffic on that dirt road. I drove into a ditch only once, but I got the car out with minimal difficulty. The worst part about that was the embarrassment. One evening, I was in a hurry and running late. I jumped in the car and flew to the worksite with something nagging in the back of my mind. I made it just in time, got my report, and settled into my routine. I did my first round with no problem. Twilight had just faded, leaving the world diving into nighttime darkness. Clouds had been forming all evening, and I saw a flock of turkeys cross my path near one of the fields. That meant it was going to storm. My first round through was a breeze. Nothing was happening. I didn't even see animals that I'd usually see, except for the turkeys. Maybe since it was going to storm, the other animals were battering down the hatches and settling in wherever they were. The drive around the 5-mile dirt road circle took around 30 minutes. They didn't like us going very fast, and technically we're supposed to check the door on each wind turbine. I and the other drivers have it timed so that it looks like we checked. I got back to the main building a little after 9:30. I pulled out my portable DVD player and started watching Die Hard. Of course, I fell asleep. I woke to credits rolling. Shit, I said, remembering my missed round. I threw the car in gear and flew off towards the wind turbines. It was right then that I remembered what I had forgotten. A flashing light announced, low fuel. I cursed myself for forgetting to fill up yesterday on the way home. This is my second round. I thought. I should have enough to make it through the rest of the night and get to a gas station. This was the thought I clung to for the rest of the night. My second round was uneventful. My eyes were constantly drawn to the fuel gauge, but there was nothing I could do about it. Once you were in for the night, you had to stay. If they caught you driving off the job, you're fired. I didn't want to lose such a gravy job, so I stayed put. Although there were a couple of times I considered a quick 2-mile trip to the gas station. The problem was my boss. He was a bit of a prick and liked to pull surprise inspections at all hours of the night. He liked to pretend he was being a nice guy and showing up to see if I needed anything, but I knew why he was really there. If he showed up tonight, I would ask him for a couple of gallons of gas. Maybe that would solve my problem and keep him from inspecting as often. Partway through my second movie, Die Hard 2, of course, I went for my next round. It had just started to rain, making my windows fog up and my defroster wasn't working the best. By the time I went for my fourth round, the weather had made a decision to switch from mildly annoying rain to grab the animals and head for the Ark. It was raining so hard I could barely see in front of me. I drove at crawling speed. The rain had worn ruts in the road. In some of the lower depressions, there were puddles across the entire road. I was glad I was driving a Jeep. I got right in the middle of one of the giant puddles where my engine gave out. I cranked and cranked, but it was no use. I was out of gas. I was never going to live this down. I could hear it now. 5 years from now, the other guys would be telling the story about the moron who ran out of gas in the middle of a rainstorm. So now I had a decision to make. Do I stay in the car and ride out the storm, or do I walk back to the main building and wait for the day shift to arrive? I checked my watch. Nearly 8 hours until my relief arrived. The way it was raining, there was no way I was walking back. If there had been an emergency gas can full of fuel, I might have considered it. But the can hadn't had any gas in it for a long time. Yet another wonderful present from my idiot boss. He said it was a waste of gas to have it sit around and grow old. I guess the concept of emergency never crossed his mind. I didn't want to drain my battery, so I didn't watch any more movies. I sat and listened to the rain pound the roof of my car like someone was dropping marbles from the sky. That's when my mind started playing tricks on me. I guess it was as bored as I was and decided to have a little fun. I was whistling a little tune in my own off-key way that makes people stuff cotton in their ears when I happened to glance in the rearview mirror, and the mirror glanced back. I swore I saw a set of eyes looking in the back window. I whipped around so fast my neck cracked, but nothing was there. I hit the door lock button just to be sure, as if that would help in the middle of nowhere in a downpour. My whistling grew louder and more off-key as I did all I could to avoid looking in the mirror. Eventually, it was too much. My eyes were drawn to the mirror like a magnet. I looked. There was nothing there. I chuckled nervously at myself for being so stupid and leaned my head back against the headrest. I don't remember falling asleep, but I do remember waking up to nothing. No sound of pounding rain, no sound of animals, no crickets even. It was unnerving. I lowered the window a few inches and listened. There was still no sound. Not even the whooshing of the wind turbine's blades as they spun. I looked at the closest one, and the blades were still. It was unusual for the wind to be so calm that it couldn't muster enough energy to turn the blades. I checked my watch and found I had been asleep for 4 hours. The storm clouds had drifted off and the moon had appeared. It wasn't quite full, but bright enough to light the ground and create hundreds of shadows of the trees that surrounded me. It was a beautiful night, the kind of night that made me glad to live in rural Pennsylvania. It made me seriously rethink waiting in the Jeep until morning. My mind held a tug of war as I hummed, should I stay or should I go? I looked at my watch again. In just under 4 hours my relief would be driving through the gate. What would he do if I wasn't there? It would be much easier to explain and have him go get me some gas rather than wait for him to do his first round and find me sitting in the middle of the road. My mind was made up. I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, staring for a long moment at the handgun sitting beside it. I thought about it, but decided to leave it behind. Most of the animals in these woods want nothing to do with humans, and the others are easily scared away with a little yelling. I locked the door as I stepped out, and my foot landed in a deep puddle. I sighed as the water oozed past my ankle and filled my sneaker. The puddle encompassed the entire car. It was easily 12 feet across. I knew that hopping on one foot wouldn't do anything but get my clothes wet, so I put my second foot down and closed the door. I started wading through the puddle to the far side until I found dry land. I shone my light at the closest wind turbine. It was number 5. I knew that was the furthest one from the gate. Being at the halfway point, it didn't matter if I went forward or back. I decided to go forward and started off on my trek. For the first part of my trip, the only sound I heard was my shoes squishing. It was unnerving having your only companions being total silence and hundreds of shadows cast from the trees. I shone the flashlight around in the trees and saw plenty of eyes shining back at me, but they were silent. It was as if they were seated in the pews of a church and I was walking up the aisle looking for my seat. The eyes ranged in size from small to quite large, and yet none of them made a sound. Were they really afraid of me? I paused to take a break, and that's when I heard it. A footstep behind me. It wasn't a heavy thud, it was a soft squish of grass under a large foot. I whipped around and shone my light where I thought I heard the sound come from, but there was nothing. I panned all around with the light, but all I saw were gravel road and endless trees. Seeing nothing was possibly worse than seeing something. A deer, a bear, even a coyote would have been something I could deal with, scare away, fight off. But nothing created this void that my mind filled with all kinds of horrible creatures. The unnerving silence continued as I started walking faster without thinking about it. Even the squish of my shoes seemed louder in the absence of woodland noises. I started thinking about my destination. It was tempting to cut through the woods and save myself a lot of time, seeing I was still on a long loop of road. Had it been daylight, I might have considered it. In the dead of night, with a nearly full moon over my shoulder and dawn hours away, I didn't give it a second thought. I thought that perhaps whistling would soothe my jangled nerves. I tried whistling the happiest tune I could think of, but the echo came back to me bent and twisted like the children's song that plays in a horror movie. I ended my whistling soon after it started. I was halfway through a verse when the tune died on my lips. The sudden, unexpected silence brought me the horrible gift of another footfall behind me. I whipped around as quickly as I could and shone my flashlight around. This time my mind wasn't given the luxury of scaring me with nothing. This time I saw a set of eyes. They were large and red, but what was most unnerving about them was their distance from the ground. Whatever it was, its eyes were a good 8 feet off the ground. It was 40 or 50 yards away and hiding behind a tree, but those eyes will haunt me for the rest of my life. Unfortunately, I didn't know how long that would be, especially with such a monstrously large creature obviously stalking me. I'd love to say that I carefully weighed my options and came to a sensible solution to what this creature was and how to deal with it. I didn't. I ran like the devil himself was chasing me. It surprised me that I kept hold of my flashlight. I found speed I never knew I had. Desperation will do that. My mind raced faster than my feet, but there was no solution it could come up with. I could hear the footfalls behind me coming closer. It was going to catch me. It was only a matter of when. As my mind grasped at any and every straw, my salvation rose in front of me like a lighthouse to a lost fisherman. One of the wind turbines loomed in front of me. I knew the code to get inside in case I ever had an emergency and would need to shut one down. I didn't think I could run any faster, but hearing the footsteps behind me and seeing my salvation in front of me, I felt like Roadrunner when he put on a burst of speed and disappeared in a cloud of smoke. Of course, that was all in my mind. Reality dashed my illusions as the sounds of massive feet grew even closer. It no longer cared about stealth. I could hear it on the gravel road now. My curiosity wanted to turn and at least identify my pursuer, but I forced myself to focus on what was in front of me. Stumbling because I wasn't focused, or because of seeing the creature that would be my doom, would be catastrophic. The 400-foot-tall monolith loomed large in front of me. I envisioned where the keypad was, knowing I had one shot to type in the code before my untimely death. As salvation grew near, panic set in. I became obsessed with the notion that I would be caught at any moment. I have no idea what possessed me to do it, other than sheer terror and desperation. I took the only thing I had available to me, my flashlight, and threw it backward. By some miracle, I heard a muffled thud and a slight groan. The sounds came from much closer than I wanted, but I still refused to look back. I reached the door to the turbine, punched in the code, and yanked the door open, straining my arm because of its weight. I was no sooner inside than I pulled the door shut. Just before it latched, a set of massive fingers appeared in the doorway. I pulled with everything I had, feeling muscles strain to the point of breaking. The door somehow continued its momentum toward closing. The giant fingers were slammed between the door and the frame. They disappeared, and I heard an inhuman howling from the other side as I shut and locked the door. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air as my mind kept replaying the image of the fingers appearing in the doorway. Like a frozen playback, I saw with startling clarity the fingers were the size of bratwursts, covered in brown hair, with claws sticking out of them. I lay on the floor panting, searching for any options, but finding none. For the moment I felt safe, but for how long would that last? How would anyone find me in here? Would they even look, or would they think I was lost in the woods? And the biggest question, what the hell was that thing? I didn't want to speculate because the possible answers were too terrible to comprehend, especially with whatever it was still outside somewhere close. Just as I began to feel my adrenaline abate, there was a pounding at the door. It reverberated through the giant hollow tube that was now my salvation and my prison. I jumped up, not knowing what to do. My only escape route led into the claws of a monster. I looked all around for any help, but finding none, I resigned myself to wait for my inevitable demise. I could see the door vibrate with every impact. I knew it was made of sturdy metal, but even metal has its breaking point. As I searched the small room that was a mere 10 feet across, my eyes were drawn upward. There, attached to the side, was a ladder. It stretched upward to infinity. There seemed to be no end. Thankfully, there were lights along the way every few feet, but that was little comfort. I wondered about my choices. Wait here for the door to collapse, or climb an impossible climb straight up with no rest points, no timeouts, no do-overs. If I climbed, it would be all or nothing. Bailing halfway up just meant I would need to climb the whole way back down to my current hopeless situation. I had no idea if I had the strength or stamina for such a climb, but another round of pounding at the door made my mind up for me. I stepped onto the ladder tentatively, as if waiting for the rung to give out under my foot. After a moment, I stepped onto the second one, then the third. The fourth rung brought near disaster. I slipped and fell back to the floor, landing in a puddle. This painfully reminded me that my shoes were soaking wet. Even though there were grip pads on the rungs, I still needed to be extra careful and step on the arch of my foot, not the ball. I got up and checked for injuries. I was sure there would be a bruise or two if I survived, but other than that, the only thing that was hurt was my pride. The thumping on the door refocused my priorities. I stood up and started up the ladder, stepping with the arch of my foot this time. I started out slowly, making sure every foothold was secure before stepping to the next rung. Soon, I gained confidence and was moving a little faster. My breathing was getting ragged as the exertion sapped my energy. I regretted skipping supper and hadn't eaten any of my snacks this evening. I paused my climb and hooked my arm into the ladder to keep me from falling as I caught my breath. It was then I made two mistakes. One was looking up, the other was looking down. When I looked up, it seemed like I was no closer to the top than when I started. When I looked down, I saw I had made enough progress to kill me if I stumbled. There was one other thing that I saw when I looked down that made me want to cry. Hanging on the wall were several safety harnesses. There was a metal cable that ran beside the ladder. For one brief moment, I considered climbing back down to get a harness, but I realized I might not have the energy to get back up. The rest of the climb seemed to take forever. My breaks became more frequent and took longer each time. My feet were screaming at me for a rest. I was near total exhaustion when I looked up and saw the top of the ladder. The excitement carried me the rest of the way. I climbed off the top of the ladder and collapsed onto the metal landing. I laid there for what seemed like an eternity until my strength returned. I stepped through the door that led into the generator room. It was cramped due to the machinery taking up most of the room. There was a small walkway beside the generator and a hatch that opened to go outside. I looked around and found a safety rig. I put it on and secured the line to a hook as I opened the hatch to the outside. Dawn had broken and the world was lit with a brilliant orange of early morning. The beauty so overtook me that I didn't notice the wind that had been still after the storm now buffeted against me, threatening to knock me off my feet. I stumbled, feeling grateful for the safety line. I watched as one of the massive blades passed by a few feet away. My only reason to take this risk was to look down and see if my pursuer had given up and left. I slowly peeked over the side, fighting the nausea-inducing vertigo from the sheer height. I looked around at the tiny trees below and I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I was about to go back inside when movement caught my eye. It was the creature. It had come around from the other side of the base of the turbine. I marveled at how tiny it looked from up here, yet it still presented me with the conundrum of how to escape. I stepped back inside and looked around for an answer. After a brief search, I found a radio amongst the controls on the wall. I pressed a button and an alarm went off. I pressed it again to silence it. I tried another button and was rewarded with static. "Hello? Hello? Can anybody hear me?" I said into the microphone. I repeated it again, still receiving static. On the third try, my boss answered. "What the hell are you doing in one of the units?" he said. It was an emergency, and this was the only way I could contact someone." He humphed on the other end. "What was the emergency?" I'd rather not say on the radio, I said. Can you come to get me? He sighed. Which unit are you in? Number 6. It'll be a little while. Like, how long? Like when I get there, he grumbled. The line went back to static. I felt some relief in the fact that at least someone knew where I was and was coming to get me, eventually. Out of curiosity, I climbed back outside and leaned over to check on the creature. My blood turned to ice in my veins from what I saw. The creature was looking up at me. It must have heard the alarm. Then it did the thing that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It started climbing the outside of the wind turbine. My eyes were drawn to the horrible sight and were unable to look away. I kept hoping it would lose its grip and fall, but it didn't. It got closer and closer. When it was around halfway up, my mind woke up to the danger and sent my body into action. I lunged back inside and closed the hatch. I unfastened the safety line and headed back for the main ladder. It took much less time going down the ladder than it did going up. Several times in my haste I slipped, nearly taking the express lane down that ended in death. Eventually, I made it. As I took a moment to catch my breath, I heard the top of the turbine being assaulted. The bangs resonated down the tube, making them sound even louder. I opened the door as quietly as possible, hoping the noise the creature was making above would cover my exit. As I did, a few brown hairs fell to the floor. I picked them up and tucked them in my pocket. As I slowly opened the door, it made a slight creak. Suddenly, the noise above me stopped. My heart leapt into my throat. I stopped breathing. My mind sent me unhelpful images of the creature jumping down and dismembering me. As I stood as still as a statue, I smelled smoke. I looked up and black plumes were flowing from the turbine. I ran as fast as I could back toward my jeep. I refused to look as I heard a roar behind me. I nearly ran into my boss's car as he turned the corner. "What the hell?" he said, getting out. Look, I said, pointing at the turbine. "I see," he said. "What the hell did you do?" "No, look," I said, pointing towards the black smoke. What am I supposed to be seeing other than millions of dollars literally going up in smoke? I stopped and looked at the burning machine, but there was no creature there. I jumped in the car and slammed my door. "Can we go, please?" I said, trying to hide my terror. He stared at me, then got in the car and drove back to the main building. The whole time, I kept shooting furtive glances behind us. He parked in front of the building and looked over at me. "You're going to have to answer some questions." "I know. Would someone please go get my car? I ran out of gas, that's why I was in the turbine." "Why didn't you just wait in your car?" I opened my mouth to answer, then realized what I was about to say and stopped, leaving it unsaid. "Okay," he said, getting out. "I'll send someone for your car." I followed him inside and lay on the couch in the break room. A short while later, a co-worker woke me. "Here are the keys to your car. It's parked out front," he said, "and the boss wants to see you." I took the keys and stood. I looked right towards the boss's office, then looked left towards the exit. It only took a moment of decision to turn left and walk out the door. I never returned, but the memory of that night has never left me, and never will. The following day I read in the paper about the turbine fire and how they found a carcass of a bear that must have got trapped inside the blaze, but I knew better. I knew the company would come after me for the destruction of their expensive turbine. I also knew if I told the truth, they'd haul me away in a rubber truck. Either way, I was about to disappear and my story would never be told. I found a group that specializes in unexplained phenomena. I walked into their office with a bag in my pocket that had 3 brown hairs in it. I knew they'd want to hear my story. I just want to thank horror writer 1717 for allowing me to narrate this story. If you liked what you heard here, head over to their Reddit page and show them some love. I'll leave a link for the original story in the description below. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, and as always, stay tuned for one more nightmare. There's something horrible in the endless fields of corn. By horror writer 1717. I should have known better. Driving in the dead of night down a dark ribbon of asphalt is enough to put anyone to sleep. Add in the complete lack of scenery, unless, of course, you count endless rows of giant corn stalks that flank both sides of the road. I don't know how they make them grow that tall. Maybe they put something special in the fertilizer. But in any case, rows upon rows of corn with nary a break in sight for miles can make me go a special kind of crazy. That is, if I can keep my eyes open long enough. I wish there was some other way for me to get home at night. Any other way. But there isn't. I live at the far end of the road, surrounded by cornfields. Going faster wasn't an option. With the corn so close to the road, I had no warning if a suicidal deer jumped out in front of me. And believe me, I've had plenty of those. Fortunately, I keep to my own personal speed limit of 40 miles per hour. It helped me to avoid making a fur hood ornament out of many a deer, not to mention the other creatures that seem to think they own the road. My car was a factor too. At this point, I'm not sure it would tolerate going much faster than 40. The engine light had gone on around a month ago, but I didn't have the time or money to get it to a garage. I just prayed every time I turned the key that it would start and get me home or to work, depending on what time of day or night it was. Those were the only places I went anymore, home or work. Occasionally, I'd stop after work and get some groceries, but that was it. When you worked at a factory like me, that seemed to think you were just another machine they could run as much as they wanted. Home and work was all your life consisted of. This night, I'd be especially glad to get home. My feet were killing me, and I was exhausted. I was due back at work in less than 12 hours and needed to get as much sleep as I could. Not that any of that was a rare occurrence. My feet were always killing me, and I was always exhausted. Even on my days off, all I did was sleep, trying to catch up from the week of working 12-hour days. The corn seemed to be blurrier than usual tonight, and I caught my eyes going closed more than a few times. I woke up to the sound of metal grinding and lights flashing on my dashboard as the car lurched to a stop. There was no time to pull over. It ground to a halt in the middle of the road. Futilely, I tried to start it a few times, only to be rewarded by the sound of metal grinding against metal. No, I said. Please don't do this to me. It ignored my pleas. Closing my eyes, I turned the key one last time, praying for a miracle. The engine didn't even click. It was done. I smacked my head off the steering wheel in frustration, not doing any damage to the wheel, but starting me on a headache. The lights were still lit, but just beyond their dying, dirty yellow glow, the overwhelming darkness closed in. Taking a moment to gather my thoughts, I realized I was at least 10 or more miles from home. My feet were still hurting from work, and even resting them as I sat in the car wasn't comfortable. I didn't relish the idea of walking, let alone for miles. It was a little after 3 in the morning. Even if I was able to afford AAA, no one was going to drive out here at this time of night. For a brief moment, I thought about sleeping in the car, but there was always a chance of being run over by one of the tractor trailers that hauled corn from the local farm that surrounded me. Dying in an accident because I was too stupid to get out of the road would be just my luck. I decided to avoid that scenario. As much as I hated the thought, I would have to walk. Grabbing my work bag and a flashlight out of the glove compartment, I turned on the hazard blinkers and got out of my car, knowing it would be the last time. I only hoped I would get some trade-in value for it when I went to buy a used car I couldn't afford. But with my luck, the dealership would probably charge me more to tow it than they would give me on a trade-in. Not bothering to look back, I turned on the flashlight and started walking. Pain shot through my feet and up my legs with every step. After 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped and sat in the grass on the side of the road, digging through my work bag for the bottle of ibuprofen that I carried and used every day. Fortunately, there was enough water left in my bottle to wash 3 of the pills down. It took every ounce of my willpower to get up and start walking again. The pain hadn't gone away, it had gotten worse. I silently prayed that the medicine would kick in soon. Trying to focus on something, anything other than my feet, my flashlight swept back and forth across the road, sometimes catching the edges of the cornfields. It wasn't supposed to be cold today. The temperature was in the lower 60s this afternoon, yet for some reason I caught a chill as I walked. I guessed I hadn't planned on walking home tonight. It had been warm enough that I hadn't brought a jacket to work. Now, I regret that decision. As if reading my mind, the wind kicked up, sending a gust my way, causing me to shiver. What's next? A rainstorm? I thought. I looked up into the pitch-black sky with not a single star in sight, waiting for the impromptu shower that was sure to come. That was the way my luck was running. As I waited for the downpour, I trudged on, each step delivering pain. I wished there was a way to prove that the company was at fault, sue them, and retire. But I knew there was no proof. Others before me had gone through the same thing, and none of them had any proof either. They just slowly disappeared, one by one. Management found some excuse to fire them, and since the company was such a large employer in the town, the fired person was also blacklisted. I know they say blacklists don't exist. Tell that to the people who were fired and weren't even given unemployment because the company didn't want to pay for it, so they bullied people into keeping their mouths shut. If only I could get another job, but the company was the highest paying around, by a slim margin. That's why they built their factory in a depressed area. No competition. And no one could afford to take even a minor pay cut with the way insurance costs were, not to mention such frivolous things like food. As depressing as the thoughts were, they distracted me from the pain in my feet and legs as I walked down the road, hugging myself, trying to keep the flashlight pointed ahead, shivering from the wind. As my shaking hand made the light jump all around, I saw a set of eyes peek out of the cornfield ahead of me, then dart back and disappear. At first, I thought it might have been a dog or a cat, but it seemed too big to be either of those. That thought concerns me. Having something bigger than a dog peeking out of the cornfield at me when I was miles away from any help or shelter wasn't high up on my to-do list at the moment. But the fact that it ducked back into the field gave me a boost of confidence, knowing that it was more afraid of me than I was of it. When I got to the point where the animal had peeked out, I slowed and shone my light in through the impenetrable curtain of corn stalks. There were no eyes and nothing jumped out at me, so I shrugged and continued my painful march toward home. The wind whipping through the cornstalks sounded like a rainstorm. It made me feel even colder, if that was possible. 15 minutes later, I took another rest break. At least the wind was dying down. With literally miles before I could go to sleep, I was taking comfort in anything I could. After my break, getting up was harder. The pain had gotten worse instead of better. I didn't want to think of the blisters forming on my feet or how I was going to get to work later on today. It didn't matter if you'd never taken a sick day in your life. The company did everything they could to make you feel like a piece of crap for even attempting to call off. I truly believe if I went to work with a severed arm, bleeding all over, they'd hand me a mop and tell me to get to work. As my hopelessness and bitterness fought over which felt more justified, I heard something behind me. It sounded like the corn stalks rustling, so I ignored it as the wind and kept walking. The next problem my mind decided to torture me with was my car. How was I going to get to work without a car, and how was I going to afford a car if I couldn't get to work? A wonderful conundrum I would have to solve later today. As I wrestled with that problem, I heard the corn stalks rustle again. I stopped and looked around. The wind had died down and the air was still. None of the stalks were moving. In fact, it had become eerily quiet. I shone my flashlight into the corn, doing a slow turn to search for whatever had made the noise, but I didn't see anything. Not entirely satisfied, I turned and started walking again. It wasn't long before I heard the rustle. This time, I didn't stop, and neither did it. I went a little faster, so did the noise. I broke into a run, and the noise kept pace with me. I skidded to a stop, nearly stumbling. The noise in the cornfield stopped as well. There was no doubt about it. Something was following me. It was keeping pace with me. It was stalking me. I turned toward the field and shone my light into the wall of green. The wind was still and there was no movement. I could feel the stillness. The chill I felt no longer had anything to do with the temperature. I wanted to see what was following me, but at the same time, I didn't want to know. Out here in the middle of nowhere, I was on my own, and I didn't like my chances of fighting off a predator. There was nothing I could do about it. The closest thing I had to a weapon to defend myself was my flashlight, and I was sure that wouldn't do much against a determined predator. For a fleeting moment, my mind thought, you know what? Bring it on. At least if something attacks and kills me, I won't have to deal with walking miles on feet that feel like razor blades are tearing them slowly to pieces. It's awesome to realize that your mind is actively trying to kill you. With nothing left to do but walk, that's exactly what I did, trying my best to ignore the pain as well as the disturbing feeling in the back of my mind that I was being hunted. As soon as I started, the sound started beside me. I did my best to ignore it, shooting furtive glances into the cornfield now and then. Didn't have any results at first. But after a few minutes, I noticed I could see something pale through the corn. It was walking next to me in the first row of corn, maybe trying to get a feel for what I was. The funny thing was, that's exactly what I was trying to do. Stopping and ripping open the layer of corn stalks was a last resort. I didn't want to spook this thing into attacking. For the time being, I began thinking of it as my walking buddy, my companion on a dark night with only a flashlight to keep me company. Thinking that helped me keep the fear at bay. I had no sooner thought it until a light appeared on the road in the distance. I watched with great curiosity as it came closer. It was moving fast and almost to me. Apparently, it didn't care if something jumped out in front of it. It was close enough now that I could see it was a big rig truck. It must have been one of the ones that deliver corn from the farm. I waved my arms in hopes of flagging it down and perhaps grabbing a ride home. The problem was it was going in the opposite direction, and there weren't many places on this road where a big rig could turn around, even if it would. Waving my arms, I still stayed on the side of the road. If the driver didn't see me, or worse, didn't care, I didn't want to be found in the middle of the road days later as nothing more than an unidentified bloody lump of goo sitting in the middle of the road for crows to peck at. The truck was almost here. My arms waved furiously, but it didn't seem to be slowing down. Either the driver was having a hard time staying awake, as I often did on this road, or he was just ignoring me. It was so near, the headlights blinded me, and I had to hold my hand over my eyes. Just then, I felt something push in the middle of my back so hard I lost my balance and fell in the middle of the road with the truck bearing down on me. My mind went into panic mode and I scurried like a crab towards the side of the road, the truck's tires missing me by mere inches. As I rolled onto the grass on the far side of the road, the wind from the passing truck washed over me so strong, if I'd been standing, it could have knocked me down. I watched in shock as the truck continued on. Its brake lights didn't even flash for a moment. Hopelessness and rage fought for control as I watched the lights disappear into the distance. It didn't even dawn on me how I had ended up in the middle of the road until I stopped to think about it. Someone or something had pushed me. Someone or something wanted me dead. I shone my light over the corn and stared at the other side of the road. Something in the corn stared back. All I could see was a pair of glowing eyes. They were somewhere between white and yellow. I seem to remember reading somewhere that a predator's eyes would shine white or yellow when reflecting in light. This, plus the fact that this thing had just tried to commit truckicide, made me think the chances of me getting home tonight in one piece were next to zero. It must have sensed my fear and felt emboldened by it, because it stepped out of the corn towards me. It took my mind a moment to sink in what I was even seeing. It was hideous, with large protruding eyes, pale skin, and many more arms or legs than any animal was supposed to have. At least any natural animal. The extra arms dangled just behind its neck, but they looked oddly human with the exception of thorns growing out of them and razor-sharp claws. It looked like something out of a horror movie, as if someone had been playing around in the gene pool and the lifeguards blew the whistle on them. It was bigger than a dog, but it had no fur, like it had been skinned. The thing that sealed the deal was its enormous sharp teeth that it showed when it hissed at me and started across the road. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran into the field on my side of the road. When I was younger, my friends and I used to play hide and seek in the cornfields, and one of the first things I learned was never run in a straight line. I zigzagged and doubled back as the terror in my mind gave my feet the will and strength to escape. At least the moon was half full, or was it half empty, giving me a little light to see my path. And then, as suddenly as I'd started, I stopped, dropped, and did everything I could to be as quiet and still as possible. It wasn't easy, especially at first when my breaths were coming in ragged gasps and I had to cover my mouth, trying to breathe slowly and quietly when my oxygen-starved lungs were screaming for more air as quickly as possible. One of the lessons I'd learnt early on in my hide-and-seek career was, when you dropped, make sure you're in a comfortable position. I'd forgotten that lesson tonight, maybe out of sheer terror. When I dropped, instead of sitting, I was on my knees in the ready position in case I had to run quickly. A wise position to be in if I were to be found right away. However, After 15 minutes of sitting on my knees, I'd realized my mistake. I was about to change position when I heard a soft rustling of corn stalks behind me. Every fiber of my being froze, and I stopped breathing. It moved slowly, searching methodically. Even though I knew it was trying to make as little sound as possible, I could hear the soft rustles of corn stalks brushing against it and feel the ground give slightly with every step it took. It was in the row beside me. I knew it was a bad decision, but I looked over at the spaces in between the stalks at its horrifying body. It was bigger than a dog, but the extra arms it didn't walk on were covered in sharp-looking thorns and claws. I didn't dare look up as far as its face and mouth for fear I would start running right then. And then it hit me. If I could see it, then it could possibly see me. Was this thing just toying with me? I'd seen that so many times as a kid. The seeker would pretend not to see someone hiding and pass by only to jump back and scare the crap out of the hider a moment later. This creature was almost past me. Was I about to suffer the same fate? Would it pass me, letting me believe I was in the clear, only to whip around and sink its claws and teeth into me? I was about to start shaking. I could feel it. I had to get that under control real quick. There was still a chance it hadn't seen me. That was the hope I clung to. If it knew I was here, there was nothing I could do about it anyway. I wasn't that little kid anymore. I couldn't jump up and sprint at a moment's notice. I was amazed my feet had allowed me to run into the cornfield. And there it was. I hadn't thought about my feet the entire time I was running in fear. But now that I wasn't, the pain came back stronger than ever. It was all I could do not to gasp from the strength of it. I imagined if this creature was chewing my feet off, it wouldn't have felt much worse. I winced and grimaced, but did all I could not to move or make any sound. Closing my eyes, I focused on anything I could except the pain, in a vain effort to make it go away or at least abate. It was a few minutes until it began to subside. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. Not just further down the row. Gone, like vanished. At first I felt relieved, but then I realized I had no idea where it was. It could literally be right behind me, and I wouldn't know. I felt the panic rising in my mind and had to fight it to keep it down. Okay, it passed me, so unless it knows I'm here, I thought, there's no reason it would stick around this area with so much more field to search. If it does know I'm here, I'm dead anyway, and there's nothing I can do about it. At least if I die, my feet won't hurt anymore. As strange as it sounded, that seemed to calm me down for the moment. Next, I focused on getting in a more comfortable position. My knees were screaming for mercy. I turned and sat in the cold dirt, making surprisingly little sound. Now was the time to rest for a minute, then consider my options. I still had my flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. At least I was getting a little light from the moon. Somewhere during the commotion, I must have dropped my bag. A shame, really, because I could have thrown it in the opposite direction to misdirect the creature. Sitting there was an option, but it wasn't one that would get me home. I could crawl out onto the road and continue on my way, hoping that the creature was so busy searching for me and wouldn't notice. I chuckled softly at the ludicrousness of that plan, and then I stopped. Why not? I thought. If it already passed me and didn't know I was there, maybe it would keep searching, oblivious that I had quit the deadly game of hide and seek and was heading home. The longer I thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. At least it was a plan, something to focus on rather than impotent fear. I turned around as quietly as possible and began crawling towards the road. After a short time, I'd had enough of that and stood, stepping sideways to brush against as few of the leaves as possible. I found the noise I made this way was less than what I did while crawling, but it was still noise. I had no idea how near or far that thing was, and if it was close, it was bound to hear me. The thought made me want to go faster, but I realized that panic would only get me caught. Besides, maybe it was making just as much noise, looking for me. As I comforted myself with that thought, I felt the first raindrop hit my cheek. Looking up, I watched the moon disappear behind rain clouds, and with it went my light. At this point, it didn't matter. I was on a road that was heading towards the road, hopefully, and once I stepped out onto the road, I could use my flashlight again, covering it up and only allowing a sliver of light to escape at a time. I kept walking, glancing behind me from time to time as the rain intensified. It wasn't long until the fear of the last hour or so gave way to a shivering as the cold rain soaked into my clothes. I once again lamented not bringing a coat. All I could see were a few corn stalks in front of me. The storm had robbed me of even the little light the moon had provided. The rain pounded harder so that I could barely hear myself walking. I took the opportunity to walk faster when suddenly the corn stalks disappeared. It happened so fast I nearly lost my balance and fell face first onto the road. I had made it out of the field. I felt like hooping and hollering, but that would just tell the monster where I was. Instead, I turned my flashlight on and covered it with my hand. Looking left and right, I remembered which side of the road I was on and turned left to start for home again. I breathed a silent prayer that the thing would stay lost in the field until I was home, in bed, asleep. The rain was coming down in sheets, but I trudged on through it. The monster chasing me took away any thought of rest breaks. The next time I sat down would be in my living room. I limped on through the rain, pain shooting through my feet, but I didn't care. I wondered if I would make it all the way home. It had to be at least 6 or 7 miles away, through the pouring rain, with the homicidal monster hunting me. I never thought all that would happen when I left for work this morning. As I pondered my survival, the rain in front of me began to glow. I stopped and watched as a shadowy figure rose out of the pavement. What now? I thought. Have I entered the frickin' Twilight Zone? Staring at this growing apparition, I suddenly realized it was my shadow. I whipped around and saw a truck barreling down the road toward me. It could be my salvation, or my doom. I aimed my light at the driver's side windshield and prayed for the best. For one long moment, nothing changed. The truck kept coming just as fast as ever. Then, miracle of miracles, I heard it slow with the jake brake and eventually come to a stop beside me. The driver's side window came down and a large woman stuck her head out through it. "Are you nuts?" she screamed. "You're trying to get yourself killed?" "No, ma'am, my car broke down," I called back. "I was just trying to get home." She shook her head. "Where's home?" I pointed in the direction she was headed and said, "Around 7 miles that way." She looked at me as I stood in the pouring rain and, for an instant, I thought she would roll up her window and leave me standing there. Of all the terrors I'd dealt with tonight, that would be the worst. "All right, get in," she said, nodding towards the passenger side. I ran around and climbed up into the cab, profusely apologizing for getting her seat wet. "It's a company truck," she said. "It don't matter to me." She put the truck in gear and slowly started forward as I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes. "Was that your car back there in the middle of the road?" she said. "Yes, ma'am," I said. She looked at her odometer. "Well, you walked around 4 miles so far," she said. I nodded as we picked up speed. Glancing in the side mirror, I saw something running down the road after us, but losing ground quickly. I knew I had escaped death by a margin of a minute. Sighing deeply, I swore never to walk this road again. Even if I broke down, I would sit in the car and wait for someone to happen by. We passed the large farm that I knew was her destination and stopped 2 miles later when we got to my house. It was the only one at the end of a cul-de-sac. The realtor told me they were going to tear it down because the housing development it was supposed to start never happened. The company had gone out of business before they could build anything other than the model house. It had sat empty for years, falling into disrepair. Instead of tearing it down, they rented it to me after doing just enough to make it livable. "Is this it?" she said, turning partway through and stopping. "Home sweet home," I said. "Thank you very much. You're a literal lifesaver." She looked at me with a question in her eyes, but I was already climbing out of the cab and closing the door. I ran to the front door, dodging raindrops as I dug out my keys and unlocked it. Closing and locking the door behind me was the best feeling I'd had in a long time. I painfully pulled off my shoes and left them on the mat beside the door, then went to the laundry room and stripped off my wet clothes. Next was the shower before throwing on a pair of pajamas and going to bed. Laying there under my warm blanket and my soft bed made the rest of the day feel like a nightmare. There was still the problem of what I was going to do about the car and how I was going to get to work, but those would wait until I got a good night's sleep. The last thing I thought about was that monster and how I'd cheated death. I wondered how many of those things were roaming around, what it was, and how many people had disappeared, like I nearly had. I woke in a dark room. Something horrible was in there with me. By horror writer 1717. Darkness engulfs me. It devours me like the creature I fear most. I try opening my eyes, but there's no difference. All I see is total black nothingness. It wouldn't be so bad if I weren't deathly terrified of the dark. At home, there's never a time where I allow darkness to fully overwhelm the light. I have night lights and security lights lining every hall and in every room. I'm never 100% in the dark. That is, not until now. I feel beads of sweat forming on my forehead at the mere thought of what could be lurking in the inky blackness that envelops me. Even the most mundane holds terror when you can't see it, but your mind tells you it's there. A throng of spiders waiting just out of reach to make me its next meal. A pit of snakes that you dangle perilously close to its precipice. If you can't see it, how can you tell if your eyes are open or closed? I reach down and press my hand against the cold floor that I lay on. I stretch out my fingers, laying them flat to feel it. The cold creeps into them, its tendrils invading my body like a virus. It feels like the darkness is digging through my skin deeper down inside me, to my bones, to my marrow, to my soul. I'm lost in the sea of gloom. I don't even know where I am. I'm terrified to make a move, lest I stumble over the invisible edge. I don't know how I got here. I don't know where here is. I've no idea why I'm here. Unless... As fearful as this mysterious place makes me, the thought of unless chills me to the marrow. The darkness is even set aside for a moment in my mind, displaced by the unless. It seems so long ago, and at the same time, it feels like it just happened. The deepest, darkest place in my soul, the thing I keep locked up tight, never to ponder, let alone discuss. The unless is untouchable. Only in my worst nightmares does my subconscious toy with the idea of the unless. No, I can't let it consume me. My thoughts running rampant won't help me to discover what this place is. I must do that first if the miracle of escape is even possible. I slowly slide my hand outward as far as it will reach, each micro moment prepared to withdraw it if harm is approached. With my senses diminished, the only way to search for harm is to sacrifice my hand, like sending out a scout to see if the area is clear or if the enemy is nearby. My hand reaches its limit unmolested. I change direction from straight out to an arc. I feel for anything like a one-winged snow angel. My hand discovers nothing, but the movement has stimulated something of my lost senses. I hear the sliding of my fingers on the floor's surface. It echoes back to me quickly. I try once again, faster and louder this time. The echoes return almost immediately. My mind absorbs the details and makes a conclusion. The room must not be very big. It augments the conclusion with the supposition that the floor is concrete. The smoothness, the cold, and the sound it makes all seem to come together. I further test the conclusion by forming a fist and knocking on the floor. The sound and feel cement the hypothesis. As I congratulate myself on my deduction, I hear something. Having not moved, I don't think the sound came from me. It happened only briefly, and I wasn't listening for any sounds outside the ones I'd made. My mind replayed it and came to a startling conclusion. It sounded like a sigh, as if someone was my unwitting cellmate in this murky prison. Relief and despair fought a furious battle at the prospect of another in my company that I know nothing about. Company in this tenebrous place would be a welcome happenstance. It may even lead to our escape if we work together. However, if I am here about the unless, then what horrid crime had they committed to be relegated to this torturous existence? Caution seemed the most prudent course. Perhaps my cellmate was unaware of my existence. Keeping it that way until I could discover more seemed a prudent goal. Armed with the knowledge of the floor's composition and the existence of a potential cellmate, I set about to gather more information about my surroundings. I rolled onto my back slowly so as not to make any noise that would alert the other to my presence. I then used my other arm to search for any obstruction within its arc. Finding none, I proceeded to move my legs out as far to the side as possible, completing my concrete angel. Next on my list for this absurd exploration, I slowly rolled over onto my stomach, making sure to feel as far out with my hand should a sudden drop-off present itself unannounced and end my journey in the most horrific fashion. Finding nothing to impede my progress, I took the next step of taking my first step. As I did, my shoe brushed the floor, making a sound that under normal circumstances would barely be noticed. However, I wasn't in normal circumstances. The effect was immediate and terrifying. This time, there was no sigh. There was a low-throated growl. I became a statue as liquid nitrogen rushed through my veins. The growl was deep and throaty, like a lion's, only somehow different. Every inch of my being clenched in a group effort to stay as still as humanly possible. My hope was that this thing would think it had made a mistake and hadn't heard the movement of his next potential meal. It was more than a hope. It was the key to my survival. The problem was I was trapped in a position kneeling on one knee, about to get up. My knee on the hard floor was starting to complain, and I knew it was only a matter of time until my balance wavered. I couldn't hold this position for long. I was already starting to shake from the effort. My balance was wavering. Beads of sweat formed on my forehead. I hoped it couldn't smell fear, because I was throwing out waves of it. My leg was shaking. My knee was screaming. I had to make a decision. Do I sit back down or go all the way to standing? Whichever I did needed to happen fast before my knee gave out and I collapsed to the floor in a noisy heap. I decided to stand. Putting one hand on my knee and the other on the floor, I pushed up and ascended. As I rose, my knee popped. It wasn't painful, but it was loud in this quiet room. So loud that it echoed back to me. I made it all the way to the standing position before I heard the growl again. This time, it was followed by sounds that were much worse. First was the sniffing sound, as if it was testing the air, searching for its prey. The second was the soft, yet unmistakable sound of a footstep. I didn't breathe as I waited to hear another. I listened for any sound, and unfortunately, I heard one. It was this thing's breath. It was low and slow, as if this monster's lungs were huge to accommodate a massive body. The sniffing continued, but the second footfall didn't come. Perhaps it was as confused as I was as to why it was here. I was never so glad about the darkness as I was at that moment. I was still terrified, but at least the darkness had become my ally, if only for a moment. I couldn't see the monster, which was a blessing in itself. My imagination was already picturing the most horrendous, demonic thing that ever cursed the planet with its existence. But the darkness was a double-edged sword. It couldn't see me either. If I stayed quiet enough, it might write me off as nothing more than a figment of its imagination. With only rhythmic breathing and no sound of pursuit, I took my first standing step away from the beast. With measured and calculated caution, I stepped away from the sound of my bane and felt silently and cautiously with the toe of my shoe to make sure there was a floor to step onto. My foot landed with the impact of a feather. I transferred weight to that leg and stepped with the other. With the lights on and no demon waiting to devour me, my motions would have been quite comical. As the situation was, they were anything but. I continued the arduous task of silent escape, listening intently for any change in the monster's breathing. Time had no meaning in this place, but if I were to guess, I would say it took me nearly half an hour to take 10 steps. The 11th step, however, was the problem. When I put my foot out, I hit something. I immediately froze. I couldn't tell if the something had been hard like a table or soft like another creature lying in wait for some poor, stupid person to stumble into it. I drew my foot back and waited to see if whatever it was reacted. The darkness didn't abate. At times, I considered holding my eyes closed. At least that would keep them hydrated. For some strange reason, it also seemed to help my focus. I listened for any sign that this object was alive and, or about to devour me. After a few moments, the only sound I heard was my own breathing. I tentatively stuck out my foot and touched the object again. It was hard and unyielding. I reached out with my arm and also touched something solid. I felt around on it and bent down all the way to the floor. It was a wall. The rough texture and ridges told me it was made of concrete block. I reached as high as I could, even getting up on my tiptoes, trying to find anything useful. I explored the wall, feeling my way to the right until I reached its corner. As tempted as I was to turn and feel down this new wall, I knew it ended on the side of the room where the monster dwelled. I had no desire to approach that thing without light and a very deadly weapon. As much as my fingers had become my eyes, my ears became my sonar, staying tuned to any sound. To this point, there hadn't been much. That didn't last. There was a shuffling sound that made me freeze. It was followed by the sounds of scraping on the concrete floor. Its soft breathing had gotten deeper and steadier. It was getting up. I stood in my corner, not moving, barely breathing, as I heard one soft footstep after another, getting louder with each step. It was curious about the other side of the room, my side of the room. I had to focus, not to give it a strong smell to follow. I hadn't used the bathroom in hours. Not that there was a bathroom in here that I knew of, but I would have used the other corner and then never returned to it until nature called again. As the monster continued across the floor, I could hear sniffing. It was hunting for me. My nerves told me to run. My mind told me to stand still. My bladder didn't care as long as it was emptied soon. The footsteps continued to approach. There was no doubt it was searching for me, and it would find me. My mind ran through every option available in a blindingly dark room with a beast searching for its next meal that was slowly approaching. I hugged the wall and started towards the other side of the room. Common sense argued that I had no idea if there was another creature on the far side of the room, but there seemed to be no choice. As we continued our silent dance, I pictured the creature passing by as I slid along the wall towards its side of the room. When we had both reached the halfway point, it suddenly stopped. I froze and held my breath as it sniffed the air. For a long moment, it was totally silent. It seemed to be holding its breath as well, as if listening for me. I kept my eyes squeezed shut and focused on being totally still. My lungs were burning from holding my breath. I knew I would soon spew out the stale air and gulp in fresh. I also knew that it would be the end of me. The creature would know I was here, and it would use the sound to track me down and tear me to bloody shreds as it devoured me. The countdown had begun in my mind. It was a matter of seconds until my lungs gave out and I had to breathe the last breath. 10, 9, 8, 7. I heard a footstep. The creature was moving again. I held my hand over my mouth and slowly exhaled. Then just as slowly inhaled. It was difficult to keep my oxygen-starved lungs from demanding more air, but I was able to catch up quietly without breathing so hard as to make noise. I continued on my perilous journey towards the unknown, carefully listening to the creature also continue its journey. As I reached the corner of my nemesis, fear gripped me as I stepped on something soft. Fear gripped me as I stepped on something soft. I waited for an attack that never came. Slowly, I reached down to explore this newfound softness. It was hair, soft fur, the kind that an animal was shed. All my suspicions were now fact. There was an animal here. It wasn't just my imagination. My fear and anxiety were fully justified. As I made my revelation, I heard my nemesis reach the far wall and bump into it. It then began sniffing in earnest. It must have caught my scent. It knew I was real too. The sniffing was getting closer, I allowed myself a moment of panic before the realization that the only thing I could do was continue my course around the room. I made my way through the blanket of fur and headed for the far wall, feeling as I went for the one thing that may hold my potential rescue: a doorknob. So far, there had been no indication of a door whatsoever. I prayed that the unexplored wall would remedy that. I continued on this insane and deadly game of ring around the rosy, stepping up my speed as much as possible while still staying silent. It's one thing to know you're being hunted. It's another thing altogether to ring the dinner bell by giving your position away. I was counting on it becoming confused when it circled back to its own nest. It was still as dark as ever, and apparently this thing didn't have any better night vision than I did. I reached the far corner and hope surged through me that I would find a door. My escape seemed imminent. I stepped up my search, going faster along this wall, but also feeling as much of the surface as possible in search of the desired door. My hopes came crashing down when I reached the next corner without finding anything. It couldn't be. It had to be here. How else did this demon and I enter the room? My despair crushed me like a ton of bricks. There was nothing left to do. This thing would eventually catch me. There was no escape. In the middle of my pity party, I noticed something. The room was silent. I couldn't hear it sniffing. I couldn't hear it breathing. I had no idea where it was. I tried to keep my breathing under control as panic washed over me. There was nothing to do but wait. In the darkness, I felt something soft brush against me. It had found me. The subtle growl was no longer across the room. It was right here in front of me. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I felt a river run down the inside of my pants as my bladder finally gave up the fight. A sharp claw ran across my throat, not hard enough to cut, but enough to let me know that I was about to die. I couldn't take it anymore. The darkness, the silence, the menace. I screamed at the top of my lungs. I screamed over and over. It wasn't even words, just primal sounds that escaped me. Every wail as a baby, every cry of pain, every shriek of fright as I woke from a nightmare. I let them all out. The screams of my victims as they suffered at my hands. The screams of their families as the court sentenced me. The screams inside my mind in a cell, alone thinking only of the unless. The unless. The unless. The unless. Suddenly, the lights came on. I covered my eyes to ward off the brightness. As I slowly adjusted, I was able to look around the room. The creature was gone. No, it couldn't be. I looked over at the wall where I had walked through the fur, but there was none. I looked all around, but there were only blank walls. Where is it? 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 I turned round and round, but it was gone. Had it ever really been here? A door opened and two large men dressed in white came in. No, I screamed. Don't come near me. It'll get you. They marched across the room, oblivious to the danger, and picked me up. It's time to go back to your room, one of the men said, picking me up under the shoulder. The doc says you've had enough therapy for today. Did you see it? I said. They carried me away without answering. We came into a hallway that stretched forever. I tried to look back at the open door. Don't let it out, I said. You've got to keep it in. They didn't bother to look back, just continued down the hall. I turned and saw it peek its head out from the room. No, I screamed. They didn't stop, didn't slow, just picked me up so my feet dangled off the floor until we reached a room. They unlocked it and set me on my bunk. "You should probably get cleaned up," one of the men said as I tried to get up, but he held me down. "You know how this goes," he said. "You stay on your bunk until we lock the door." The second man backed out of the room, then the first man released me and followed him. I ran for the door. "You don't understand. It's loose. It'll kill you all." They turned and walked away. "No!" I screamed at the tiny window at my door. I pounded on the door for a long time, but no one else came. Maybe it had already gotten them. Maybe it would come to my door and peek in my window with blood dripping from its mouth. I stepped back from the door, feeling exhausted. I looked over at the tiny shower stall and did what they suggested. Everything was built into the wall: the shower, the sink, the table, the bed. There was nothing I could use to hurt myself or defend myself. After I took a shower and put on fresh clothes, I sat at my desk and wrote what had happened with the monster. When I was done, I laid down, hoping to be able to rest. At the appointed time, the lights went out. The darkness engulfed me. It devoured me like the thing I feared most. I lay there with my eyes open, waiting. In the black nothingness, I heard it. A soft growl. There are terrible creatures in the Great Smokies you don't want to know about. By horror writer 1717.
How much further is it?
Neil whined. I had to admit, I was getting a bit tired myself. When we first decided to go on a camping trip in the Great Smokies, I wasn't expecting it would be this far.
According to the map, we're almost there,
Jean said.
You mean the map that covers the entire state?
Sharon said.
Almost there. Could be 100 miles.
Jean whipped around on her.
Do you think I'm that stupid? Of course it's not a map of the whole state. I picked it up at the ranger station. It only covers the Tennessee section of the Great Smokies.
He turned back and began trudging.
Well, pardon me, oh great map master,
Sharon said under her breath. Jean paused for a moment, then kept going. I knew he had heard her and wanted to chew her out, but with all that had happened, my thoughts were interrupted by the sounds of struggling behind me. Turning, I found Mike wrestling with his backpack. It had gotten caught in between two small trees and had him stuck fast. "Hold on there, bud," I said, trying to get down to him without getting my pack caught. Grabbing trees as I went, I worked my way down and got his pack unstuck.
"Thanks, man,"
he said, sweat pouring off him.
"As if this trip wasn't tough enough."
"I hear you," I said. "You need to take a break for a minute?"
"Yeah,"
he said, dropping to the ground. I chuckled, seeing the smallest of the group panting like a dog in the middle of summer. "Hold on here, I'll be right back." I struggled my way back up the hill, only to find the rest of the group hadn't stopped when I did. I couldn't see them. I ran for a little bit on what I thought was the trail, but didn't see any sign. Finally, in frustration, I stopped and let out a yell. "Jean! Sharon! Neil! Where are you?" I heard the words echo back to me, but that was it. There was no answering call, no sound of brush being pushed aside as they came back to me. There was nothing. Even the animals didn't seem to be very talkative. It was quieter than it had been the entire trip. Part of that was surely the lack of Neil whining and Sharon and Jean being at each other's throats. I wish those two would just give up and go get a room. Everybody knew they had it for each other bad, but they didn't seem to get it. Or maybe they did, and this is their idea of foreplay. Either way, I was a city boy lost in the middle of the forest. Jean had the map, and I had never been taught anything about direction or survival. I just came on this trip to hang out with my friends. A motel room in Gatlinburg, 5 friends catching some shows, shopping in Pigeon Forge. That was what I was here for. It was Jean's brilliant idea to go on this stupid camping trip. Even though he said he got the map at the ranger station, I knew he didn't listen to anything they said about which trail to go on. Jean was always the leader. He would have shooed them off and said he knew exactly where to go, even if he had no idea. Maybe I'm starting to see why Sharon hasn't hooked up with him yet. Maybe she's trying to knock him down a peg or two before he's ready to be civil. It had been 5 minutes since I had stopped and yelled. "Jean! Sharon! Neil!" I called again, louder this time. The only thing that got me was a louder echo coming back to me. I looked back at where I'd come from, only I wasn't sure of the exact direction. Jean had led us off the trail a while back, and I wasn't positive where I had left Mike. The dense canopy of trees left a little of the sun peeking through, still high in the sky. At least I'd have daylight for a while. Turning back the way I thought I'd come, I started back towards Mike. At least if we were together, there'd be 2 of us to find instead of having to search for another. It was a long walk. It seemed like I got to where I was a lot faster than I got back. I suppose trying to catch up with the people who know where they're going will get your feet moving faster. It wasn't long until I realized I'd been walking too far. I had somehow missed where Mike was. "Mike, where are you?" I called, once again hearing the echo and nothing else. Looking around, I was sure this is where I'd left him. The trees all looked familiar, but then again, I didn't know how many millions of trees there were in the Smoky Mountains. There could be hundreds or even thousands of spots that looked exactly like this one. I began to question the wisdom, or lack thereof, of only one person having a map. A thought struck me. I whipped out my phone and tapped on the Maps app. Surely it could at least tell me where I am. Those hopes crashed and burned when I saw the "no signal" at the top of the screen. "Mike!" I yelled louder, more to vent my frustration. I collapsed on the ground, feeling more exhausted and hopeless than I had in a long time. And then I heard it. A faint call carried on the wind. It sounded like it was miles away. "Mike!" I yelled again. I sat and listened, which was easy since the animals weren't making any noise. Again, I heard the return call. I hopped up like a dog who had heard its master's whistle. Taking a general guess at the direction I'd heard it, I began to march determinedly. It wasn't quite a run, but it was no stroll through the park either. The thought of no longer being lost, or at least not being lost alone, drove me forward. After a few minutes, I called again, then waited for the answer. It came from the direction I was heading, but somehow seemed quieter, like he was moving away from me. I broke into a run. My heavy backpack flopped from side to side, nearly making me stumble, but I didn't care. I was getting closer. I could feel it. I never saw the tree roots sticking up just enough to catch my toe and send me tumbling. I woke up to total darkness. Something big and heavy was pressing down on me. I panicked and tried to throw it off, but it had a tight grip on me. Thrashing all around, this thing held me with a death grip. I swung my arms, trying to punch it. My legs flailed to get it off me, but it wasn't happening. It had me, and it knew it. The most disconcerting part was how quiet this thing was. It didn't growl or snarl or anything, just held on to me like its life depended on it. Finally, my energy was spent. It had won. All I could do was lay there and wait for the inevitable. I waited and waited. Nothing happened. Maybe whatever it was had fallen asleep. I couldn't imagine all my thrashing around wouldn't have woken it up. I rubbed at my shoulder, which was now sore from the fight with my unknown assailant. As I did, my fingers brushed up against the thing that held me. Out of curiosity, I rubbed it where it held me. I immediately pitched a fit at my stupidity. It was my backpack. My head thumped off the ground in frustration at how stupid I'd been. Slowly, I unsnapped the latch that held the straps together and pulled my arms out. It was a huge weight off my shoulders when the backpack rolled onto the ground. I lay there for a moment, having forgotten how dark it was when I was fighting to the death with my backpack. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my cell phone and turned on the flashlight. As I was doing it, I saw the no signal was still at the top of the screen. I wondered if there would be any signal until I got out of this godforsaken place. I shone the light around and pieced together how I'd gotten here, lying in a ditch, in the dark, in the forest. When I fell, I must have hit my head on the rock I saw in the ditch that had a small patch of dark red on it. I reached up to feel my head and found a tender spot. "That'd do it," I said of my unscheduled nap. Checking the rest of me out with the flashlight, I found no other injuries. There remained the original problem of being lost and alone. At least the animals were making noise again. That was somewhat comforting. Having evaluated myself, I shone the light around the area trying to find out where I was. The answer was simple and frustrating. I was lost in the forest, surrounded by trees. Letting out a sigh, I dug through my backpack and found some granola bars and a couple of bottles of water. Hunger pangs hit me in the gut like a line drive. I ripped open a bar and devoured it. Before I knew it, 3 of them were gone, followed by a bottle of water chugged like I was in the middle of the desert. As I was enjoying my feast, the animal noises stopped. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end to hear such sudden and complete silence. Swallowing my last mouthful of water was so loud, it nearly made me jump. As my light drifted aimlessly, suddenly I saw a pair of eyes glowing just inside the tree line. They glowed an eerie shadow of yellow. I tried to remember if that meant it was a predator. Unfortunately, something in the back of my mind told me the silence was already telling me it was a predator. Whatever it was, strangely, it seemed to have no fur. Its grey skin made it look like no animal I'd ever seen. If anything, it reminded me of Gollum from Lord of the Rings. It was on all fours, but the front legs looked like arms. If I didn't know better, I would have said it was a child lost in the woods. But this was no innocent child. It crept toward me in a way that assured me it was hunting and nothing else. Nothing about the way it moved said helpless to me. I unzipped my pack and reached down to the bottom, all the while the predator creeping closer. "Come on," I said through gritted teeth, knowing it was down here as I moved things from one side of the pack to the other. It was getting worrisomely close now. One good leap, and it would be within striking distance. I went for broke and dumped out the contents of the pack, hearing a loud thump hit the ground. I flashed around with my light and found what I'd been looking for. My Glock. I grabbed it and pointed it where the predator had been, fully expecting it to be right in my face. But it was gone. Whipping all around, I searched with the light, gun trained on whatever I saw, hoping to catch a glimpse before it was too late. After a quick scan, I slowly panned around in a circle, searching more diligently for the creature, but there was nothing. wanting to breathe a sigh of relief, but knowing it could easily be hiding behind any tree. I started picking up my belongings and stuffing them back into the backpack. As I did, the animals began making noise again. It was somewhat comforting to think that thing had left the area, but I didn't trust it. Once my backpack was repacked, I sat down and leaned on it like a pillow, with my back to the edge of the ditch and my phone's flashlight shining toward the trees. My gun sat on my lap, ready for some quick action. It wasn't long until my eyes betrayed me, slowly closing, causing me to shake myself awake. Over and over, this played out, with me struggling harder to stay awake than when I was sitting in church. My phone told me it was after 4 in the morning. The sun would be coming up in a couple of hours. Then I could continue my search for my friends. My phone also told me it only had 23% battery left. I held a major debate in my head. Keep the light on and lose the ability to use my phone if and when I get a signal, or turn the light off and save my battery, leaving me at the mercy of that creature. It was an impossible choice until I remembered the animals in the woods were making noises. They were silent when the creature was around. My only question was, do they shut up just for that creature or for all large predators? For the life of me, I couldn't remember. I took one last look around before powering off my phone. Leaning against the pack, my fight to stay alert continued. Each time my eyes snapped open, the sky was a lighter shade of grey. Soon, I could see vague outlines of trees looming over me, not frightening or disconcerting at all. At last, I lost the battle and fell into a deep, blissful sleep. I woke to the feeling of sandpaper on my face. Opening my eyes and seeing a deer licking my cheek made me nearly lose my mind. I jumped back, slipping off my pack and falling against the dirt in the ditch. The deer lost its mind as well. It jumped up and galloped away like a herd of hunters were hot on its heels. Once my heart was beating at a regular rate, I looked around at the brightly lit forest. It was late morning and I was still alive. The creature had not come back to kill me in my sleep. I took that as a good sign. Standing and stretching, I tried to figure out how I was getting out of there, let alone how would I find my friends. Shouting was out of the question now. I was sure that creature would see it as a sign of weakness and come running like someone had rung the dinner bell. But how would I find which way I was going before I fell into the ditch? As I stood there and looked back at the trail, I saw the branch sticking up that had caused this whole debacle. I drew an invisible line from where I was standing to the branch. I then followed the line through me and extended it past me towards where I was heading. Looking up to the mountain looming above the trees, I tried to find a landmark to head towards. There was a huge rock that jutted out from the mountain with no trees around it. That was my focal point. I would use that as my compass. Speaking of compasses, I looked to the right and saw the sun rising into the late morning sky. With the sun in the east, I turned back towards my rock and calculated that it was more or less to the north. Having figured out where I was going, I kicked my feet into gear and started getting there. It was a no-brainer that my friends would be worried sick. They were probably already back at the motel, making all kinds of calls and organising a search party. I chuckled at my joke. I knew they were as helpless as I was in the woods. Gene pretended to know what he was doing, but truth be told, he was the worst of the group, mostly because he was too stubborn to listen to anyone else's directions. What if they ran into that creature? The thought froze me in my tracks. That thing looked like it wanted to have me for dinner. Running into the 4 of them would be like a smorgasbord. I shook the thought away. There was nothing I could do about it anyway. But my cheerful skip in my step at having determined a direction was gone. It was replaced by concern for my friends. As I walked, I thought about Mike, how excited he was to come along and see the Dixie Stampede for the first time. About Sharon and Jean, what a horrible couple they would make, and how they fought all the time now when they were just friends. Or were they? I'd seen them sneaking little looks at each other when the group was together. Could the whole thing be a ruse? Could they be a couple already and trying to keep it a secret? And then there was Neil. I had no idea why I was friends with Neil. He was one of those people who just started tagging along one day. Before you knew it, they were part of the group. Neil was always competing with Jean to lead the group, but he went about it a different way. He would whine and complain until he got his way. Not all the time, but whenever there was something he felt strongly about. Neil didn't want to come on this trip, and honestly, I think we all would have been happier if he hadn't. Being alone with my thoughts had me making good time toward my destination. The forest wasn't as dense here, and it was slightly downhill. Good walking conditions. The walk was going so well that I nearly started whistling. I squashed that real quick. I didn't need any additional noise for the creature to track. As it was, I would turn and look over my shoulder from time to time, just to be sure no one or nothing was following. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, the sky behind me seemed to be getting darker. The sun soon disappeared, and I could no longer deny it. There was a storm coming. I was stuck. There was no shelter except for trees, and rain leaks through them eventually. Even though I knew I would get caught out in the rain regardless, I stepped up my pace. Perhaps there was a rock outcropping I could shelter under. As I walked, there was a blinding flash, followed by a deafening boom that knocked me to the ground. At first, I thought a bomb had gone off. I looked around and saw a tree burning on the mountain. It looked like some giant had ripped it in half. Staring at this apparition and wondering what the hell was going on, I saw another flash that lit up the clouds. This time, the thunder was farther away, but still shook the ground. It was time to find that shelter before Mother Nature chose me as the target for her next lightning bolt. I ran towards the mountain as huge drops of rain pelted my back. It felt like I was getting hit by mini water balloons. It didn't take long for the rain to intensify, quickly becoming a deluge. The water came down so hard and fast that the ground didn't have time to soak it up. Since I wasn't on the trail anymore, I stumbled through puddles and mini bogs, struggling to stay on my feet as the muddy ground tried to swallow me whole. I held my hand above my eyes, trying to see where I was going, but the rain came down in sheets, reducing visibility to zero. Through it all, I kept trudging as straight as possible, hoping to find shelter. Without warning, I ran into something hard. It looked like I had reached the base of the mountain. I kept one hand on the rock face to guide me while trudging parallel to the mountain. Suddenly nothing was pressing against my hand. I hadn't realized how much I'd been leaning on the rock until it wasn't there. I fell onto the surprisingly dry ground. Rolling over and looking up, I discovered I was in the mouth of a cave. I sat up and enjoyed watching the rain fall helplessly outside the cave while I was safe inside from the fury of nature. After a short rest, I began to rub my arms to stave off the chill of the air. I took my backpack off and looked through for anything that would be helpful. Fortunately, I'd packed a sweatshirt. I took off my soaked t-shirt and used it for a towel before donning my warm, somewhat dry sweatshirt. While I was looking, I pulled out another granola bar and devoured it, then downed my last bottle of water. Staring at the empty bottle, I held it out to one of the streams of water falling from the sky until it was full. Putting the cap on, I noticed the water wasn't as clear as I would have liked, but I wasn't out of the woods yet, and I might need it somewhere down the road. I sat the pack down, leaning it against the side of the cave entrance, then pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The light penetrated only so far into the darkness. Even the diminished daylight could only illuminate so much. After that, it was like a shadow wall, showing only a large, black hole. I stared into the inky blackness before I remembered and felt for the gun in my back waistband. I pulled it out and checked it, then dried it off and stuck it back in my waistband. I didn't see the need to have both of my hands occupied if I stumbled. I explored the first few feet of the cave, finding nothing spectacular, and was about to come back to my pack and sit out the rainstorm when I smelled something. It was faint at first, drawing me several steps further inside the cave before I could be sure. My mind had to be playing tricks on me because I swore I could smell a barbecue. My curiosity and growling stomach overrode common sense and drove me deeper into the cave. The light of my phone illuminated my steps as I carefully made my way towards the amazing smell of food. It wasn't long until there was a glow in front of me. A fire burned in the distance, just visible, bathing the cave walls in an orange glow. As the promise of a warm fire tantalized me, drawing me closer, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye that made my spine turn to ice. Coming from the far side of the fire was the creature that had stalked me the night before. At least, it looked like the same creature. The eyes shone yellow in the fire's light. It walked on all fours and struck an amazing resemblance to Gollum from Lord of the Rings. I closed my light and threw myself behind a rock that seemed big enough to conceal me. Straight ahead of me was the pinprick of light that was the cave mouth and the outside beyond it. Even if I wanted to, the creature would see me and hunt me down if I tried to escape while it was within sight. Daring to sneak a peek, I leaned around the rock to see if it was still there. What I saw horrified me. The creature was tending to the fire, seemingly oblivious to my presence. It checked the pieces of meat that lay across hot rocks beside the fire. He then took a few off and set them aside. Then he walked toward the left wall and disappeared. I leaned out a little further to find out what he was up to, and I wished I wouldn't have. Hanging from a large wooden frame, tied in spread eagle, was a human male who had been skinned. The creature came up to him and carved several chunks of muscle with a large, primitive-looking knife. Once satisfied, he brought the pieces of meat back to the fire and laid them on the hot rocks where the cooked pieces of meat had been. He then took the pieces and disappeared into a hole in the wall. I threw myself behind the rock, breathing hard at the realization. Oh my God, that thing killed someone and it's eating him. My stomach lurched at the thought. It took all I had to keep from vomiting on the spot, but I knew how loud I could get when I puked, and I had no desire to let that thing know I was here. I peeked around the corner again and didn't see it. My eyes were drawn to the dead body hanging there. For the first time, I noticed there was another body strung up beside him. It was another naked male, but it hadn't been skinned yet. 2 more bodies hung beside that one, 1 male, 1 female, both naked. Realization hit me like a sledgehammer as I realized the naked woman was Sharon. Looking again, I saw the men were Neil and Mike. No, I said, abandoning any semblance of subtlety and charging over to see my friends. When I got there and stood face to face with them, hot tears rolled down my cheeks. Their eyes were closed and none of them moved a muscle. I went to them one by one and felt for a pulse, just to be sure. I came to the one who had been skinned first. He had no pulse. My only guess was it was Jean. Next, I moved on to Mike. There was a scar on his neck and gore down the front of him. He also had no pulse. Neil was the same way, scar on his neck and no pulse. As I got to Sharon, I noticed something about her chest. It was moving. She didn't have a scar on her neck. I reached up to take her pulse, and her eyes shot open. Instantly, she began to scream. I covered her mouth with my hand, but I knew it was too late. "You need to be quiet and pretend you're dead, or I will be. You understand?" I said, still holding her mouth. She nodded, and I ran behind them as I heard footsteps approach. I stood behind Gene, since he was the biggest of our group, and put my hands and feet behind his, posing in the same spread eagle. My only hope was that it didn't notice me. I didn't dare move as I heard footsteps enter the room and come over to where we were. I stood as still as a statue. Only my eyes looked over to where Sharon was hanging. I saw the creature stand and look at her. She had lowered her head again, looking every bit asleep or dead. The creature poked her breast with the knife, drawing a few drops of blood, but she refused to move. And then another creature stepped up to her, and a third. They poked and prodded her to see if she was awake, but she wasn't moving. Panic grew inside me. How many of these things were there? If I knew it was just one, I would have already shot it. But if hundreds waited in the darkness of the cave side rooms, there was no chance. My thoughts were interrupted when I heard sounds coming from them. It was like chittering insects communicating. They spoke back and forth while standing in front of Sharon, who still refused to move. As the argument became heated, I noticed one of the creatures looking in my direction. The longer I watched, the more I realized it wasn't looking in my direction. It was looking at me. It stepped around Sharon to the backside when its eyes grew wide and it began to screech. The other two looked from it to where it was looking and eventually found me. Their eyes narrowed as one came around in front of Jean's body and the other stepped between Neil and Mike. The one holding the knife was closest when I gave up on my deception, drew my gun, and shot all three. The sound of the shots in the cave made me instantly deaf. The only thing I could hear was my ears ringing. I grabbed the knife off the ground and cut Sharon down. She collapsed like a bag of rocks. "We should go," I said.
What?
She said. "We should..." "Never mind," I said, picking her up and carrying her over my shoulders like a fireman. I struggled to carry her and hold the gun. She kept slipping off my shoulder and I would have to grab her to keep her on. The thing was, I was grabbing her naked behind every time. It wasn't like I had a choice or was enjoying it. If I didn't, she would fall off. As I ran, legs already starting to tremble, I felt a rock fly past my chest. I looked back and there were many more of the creatures running after us. I didn't have time to stop and aim, but I pointed towards the closest one and squeezed off a shot. By some miracle, the creature fell. I didn't know if I'd hit it or the sound of the gun frightened it, causing it to fall. I had no chance to celebrate as the first rock hit me in the back of the head, nearly causing me to stumble, which would have been fatal. Instead, I pointed and fired another shot, hearing a most satisfying scream. The cave grew brighter as the mouth grew closer. Then suddenly, we were out. It wasn't a cause for celebration though. I glanced back to see a horde of creatures following us out of the cave as well. So close, and yet so far. My legs weren't going to last much longer carrying her. I needed a break, and I needed it soon. I didn't think they would stop if I turned around and called a time out. To punctuate that point, another rock hit me, this time on the back. I pointed and fired again in response, disappointed not to hear another scream. Finally, the inevitable moment came. I tripped. Sharon and I went head over heels in a tangled heap. By some miracle, I managed to hold on to my gun. I tried to jump up, but ended up falling to the side, still aiming and shooting another creature. They tried to get around us, but I shot 2 more. Scrambling to my feet, I was able to aim much better and shoot another. They still greatly outnumbered us. There were too many of them to count. I aimed at groups, hoping to get more than 1 kill at a time. They still tried to flank us, and I shot them as they did. But the inevitable moment finally came. My slide locked back. I instantly released it, just in case any of them knew what it meant. I continued to aim at them in a threatening way, and they held their distance, not wanting to be next shot. But they had encircled us, and were closing in. I looked at Sharon to say goodbye, but she wasn't looking at me. She had my phone and was doing something with it, hopefully calling for help, even though I knew no help would get here in time to save us. Staring into the nightmare faces of these bloodthirsty cannibals, I prayed a prayer of utter desperation. The first one was within reach, when suddenly the most piercing sound came from behind me. Looking back, I saw Sharon holding my phone up with one hand and her ear with the other. I held my ears as well. The creatures tried to cover their ears but screamed in agony at the sound. As a group, they ran back to the cave, holding their ears as they went. I couldn't believe it. Turning to Sharon as she shut the alarm off, I smiled. "Well, aren't you clever?" I said.
Not clever enough.
She said, looking at her naked body.
You think I could borrow your sweatshirt?
I chuckled as I took it off and gave it to her. "We should find a road and get out of here before they decide to come back," I said. As we walked, she explained what had happened, how the creatures had surrounded them, how they thought Mike and I had already been captured.
The funny thing was, Gene never gave up hope.
She said.
He kept telling us to hold on, that you would find us, even when...
"Don't tell me he was alive when they..." She slowly nodded.
I can still hear his screams.
She said with a haunted look.
I don't think I'll ever forget that.
I can't imagine.
But even after they took his face, he still told us to not give up hope.
Amazing. After walking a long time, constantly looking back every few minutes, we came to the greatest sight either of us could imagine. A road. Within an hour, a ranger came by and rescued us. It was the longest hour of our lives, keeping watch for cannibalistic creatures to jump out at us at the last second and drag us back to the cave. Our friends were never found. The ranger told us we were lucky to make it out alive. Many hikers go missing in the forest and are never seen again. I know Sharon and I never want to see another forest unless we pass by it on a highway. I just want to thank horror writer 1717 for allowing me to narrate that story, as well as my guest narrators who all took time out of their busy schedules to help me bring this story to life. Ponch Monster Studios, Jordan Group Horror, Dark Knight Tales, and Blight Research. I'll leave a link for all their channels in the description below, as well as a link for the original story where you can go and tell the author what a great job they did. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, and as always, stay tuned for one more nightmare.